This is the story of a man who tucked in the wrong child in a dark room and accidentally became the first person in 2 years to make a little girl say the word daddy. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story travels. And if you have ever been in the right place at the exact moment somebody needed you, even though you did not know it at the time, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. The morning of the company holiday party, Callum Sayer was standing in his bathroom doorway in Charlotte, watching his daughter Zara try to braid her own hair with the fierce concentration of a 7-year-old who had decided she no longer needed help. "It is crooked," he said. "It is supposed to be crooked. It is called style." He leaned against the doorframe with his coffee and let her work. She had been doing this for about 3 months now, the slow insistence on doing things herself that meant she was growing up in the specific quiet way children grow up when there is only one parent in the house and they have decided, without being asked, to carry a little more of their own weight. Her mother had died when Zara was 4. A car accident on a Tuesday afternoon so ordinary that the ordinariness of it was the thing Callum still could not make peace with. He kept very few of her things. The photographs were on his phone. The ring was in a drawer, but the pale blue blanket that Claire had carried through 2 pregnancies and every cold night of their short marriage, the one she called the only honest blanket in America because it did not pretend to be warmer than it was. That blanket had become Zara's. She slept with it every night, bunched against her chest, and Callum had never once suggested she stop. Some objects carry a person better than memory does. "Are there going to be kids at this party?" Zara asked, pulling a strand tight. "A few. The boss has a daughter. Is she nice? I have never met her. I fix the building. The boss runs it. Those are 2 different orbits." Zara processed this with the seriousness of a child who had learned that her father sometimes said practical things that were actually sad things wearing work clothes. She finished the braid. She held up Claire's blanket. "Can I bring this?" He looked at it. He almost said no, because it was a company event and blankets were not professional. Then he remembered that nothing about bringing your 7-year-old daughter to a work party because you could not afford a Friday night sitter was professional either, and the whole point of being the kind of father he was trying to be was not pretending otherwise. "Yeah, kid, bring it." Crane Interiors occupied 4 floors of a renovated textile mill in Charlotte's South End, the kind of building that had been ugly for a century and was now beautiful because someone with taste and money had decided exposed brick was worth 6 figures a square foot. Juliet Crane ran it. 38 years old, dark hair. The particular steadiness of a woman who had rebuilt her life around work the way some people rebuild around faith, because it was the only structure that held weight after everything else fell. Her husband Thomas had died 2 years ago. Sudden, senseless, the kind of loss that does not announce itself and does not negotiate. Their daughter Maisie had been 4 when it happened. She was 6 now, and she had not said the word daddy since the afternoon Juliet picked her up from preschool and tried to explain, in words a 4-year-old could stand on, that the person she loved most in the world was not coming home. Maisie talked. She functioned. She went to school and ate her lunch and drew pictures and played with other children, but that one word had simply vanished from her vocabulary, replaced by a silence so specific that the 3 therapists Juliet had consulted could only describe it as selective language avoidance. The child had not stopped speaking. She had stopped speaking the one word that hurt. The annual holiday party was held on the top floor of the building, And it was, as these things always were, Juliet's least favorite night of the year. Graham Aldrich, her vice president of business development, had positioned himself as her unofficial +1 for every event since Thomas died. Always just close enough to suggest intimacy without ever saying it outright. Always just solicitous enough that declining his attention felt like rejecting a kindness rather than refusing an advance. He arrived in a suit that cost more than most people's rent and placed his hand briefly on the small of her back as she greeted the first guests, and she moved away from it the way she always did. Too subtly for anyone but her to notice. Callum arrived through the service entrance because the front was for clients, and he was not one. He had worked at Crane Interiors for 3 years as the facilities coordinator, the person who kept the building running. Plumbing, electrical, FAC, the courtyard garden nobody else remembered to water, the freight elevator that jammed every third Tuesday. He was good at it the way people are good at things they take seriously, even when nobody else does. Most of the company knew him as the guy with the tool belt. A few knew his name. Almost nobody knew he had a daughter. Because he had never found a reason to mention it in a building where the distance between his floor and theirs was measured in more than stairs. Zara held his hand as they came up in the freight elevator because the passenger elevator was reserved for guests, and she looked up at the exposed ductwork and said, with the confidence of someone issuing an expert opinion, "This building has good bones." Callum looked down at her. "Where did you learn that phrase?" "From you. You say it about every building." He supposed he did. The party occupied the full top floor, warm light and tall windows, and the Charlotte skyline doing its best impression of somewhere more important. A children's area had been arranged in a side room with beanbags, coloring supplies, and a row of small cots along the far wall for the younger ones who would inevitably fall asleep before the adults finished pretending to enjoy themselves. Callum walked Zara to the room, and she surveyed it the way she surveyed most new spaces, carefully, noting the exits and the best reading light and the proximity of the snacks, and apparently found it acceptable. She unrolled Claire's pale blue blanket on the cot nearest the window and claimed it without ceremony. Callum went back to the party floor to check that the heating system was holding, because that was his job, and because standing alone at a company party where he knew no one socially was the kind of discomfort he had learned to avoid by staying useful. The children's room was quiet by 9:30. Most of the kids had fallen asleep in the beanbags or on the small cots, the way children do at adult events, suddenly and completely, as if someone had found their off switch. Callum slipped in at 9:45 to check on Zara. The room was dark except for the glow of the city through the tall windows, and the shapes on the cots were small and still and indistinguishable from one another. He found a cot near the window where a small figure was curled on her side, facing the wall. A pale blue blanket bunched against her chest. He crouched down, tucked the blanket higher around her shoulders the way he did every night, and smoothed the hair back from her forehead with 2 gentle fingers. "Sleep tight, sweetheart," he whispered. The child shifted. Then, in a voice so small it barely existed at all, she whispered back. "Good night, Daddy." Callum went completely still. The voice was not Zara's. He looked down. In the blue light from the window, the child's face resolved into someone he had never seen before. A small girl, maybe 6, with dark hair and features nothing like his daughter's, who had somehow ended up under Zara's blanket on the cot Zara had claimed, and who had, in the warmth of a stranger's touch and the safety of the dark, said the one word she had not said in 2 years. He did not move. He did not pull his hand away. Something in the quality of that whisper, the way it had risen from the child like something released rather than spoken, told him that moving would break something he did not have the right to break. A sound behind him. Not a footstep exactly, more like the absence of one. The specific silence of a person who has stopped walking because their body has forgotten how. He turned. Juliet Crane stood in the doorway. Her hand was on the frame. Her other hand was pressed flat against her sternum, the way people press against their chest when something inside it has come loose without warning. Her face in the half-light held an expression Callum would never be able to describe accurately, because it contained too many things at once. Shock and grief, and something rawer than both. The look of a mother hearing her daughter say a word she had been waiting 2 years to hear, spoken not to her but to a stranger kneeling in the dark. Neither of them spoke. Maisie had already drifted back to sleep, her small hand still resting on the edge of the blue blanket, as though holding on to whatever had made the word possible. Callum stood slowly. He looked at Juliet. She looked at him. And between them, in the silence that followed, something passed that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them could take back. "I am sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a breath. "I thought she was mine." Juliet opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. She tried again. "She has not said that word," she managed, "in 2 years." The sentence landed in the dark room like something that had been falling for a long time. Callum did not know what to do with it. He was a man who fixed buildings. He did not know how to stand in a doorway with a woman whose world had just tilted and pretend that the ground between them had not shifted too. He found Zara on a beanbag 3 cots over, sleeping soundly with her shoes still on, and carried her downstairs without passing through the party floor, and drove home through the quiet streets of Charlotte with his daughter breathing softly against his shoulder and the echo of a word that was not meant for him sitting in his chest like something he had accidentally picked up and could not put down. Monday morning the air between them had changed, and everybody who paid attention could feel it. Callum came in through the service entrance the way he always did, tool belt on, work order in hand, and found himself rerouting around the executive floor for no reason he was willing to name. Juliet sat in her corner office with the door open, the way she always did, and caught herself looking toward the corridor every time she heard footsteps that might be his. Which was absurd, because she had never once in 3 years noticed the sound of his footsteps, and now she could not stop hearing them. They ran into each other at the freight elevator on Wednesday. He was carrying a replacement filter. She was carrying a coffee she did not need from a floor she had no reason to visit. They stood 4 feet apart in a concrete corridor and said good morning to each other in voices so careful they might have been handling glass. "How is your daughter?" he asked, because it was the only safe thing he could think of. "She is drawing again," Juliet said. She drew a picture of a man with warm hands. She did not say who it was. "I did not ask." Callum looked at the filter in his hands as though it had become the most interesting object in the building. He nodded once. Then he stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed between them, and Juliet stood in the empty corridor for a moment longer than made sense, and thought, with a precision that surprised her, that she had not felt this particular kind of confusion in a very long time, and that it did not feel entirely unwelcome. Graham noticed it by Thursday. He had the instincts of a man who tracked shifts in attention the way traders tracked shifts in price, and he had been tracking Juliet's attention for 2 years. He did not know what had happened at the party. He simply registered that something had changed in the way she carried herself, a looseness he had not seen before, and that the change had nothing to do with him. He began, in the careful way he did most things, to find out why. Maisie, meanwhile, had begun asking about the man with the warm hands. She asked at breakfast. She asked at bedtime. She did not call him anything specific, because she did not know his name, but her questions were detailed and particular in the way only a child's questions can be. Were his hands really that big? Did he always smell like that? Like what? Juliet asked. Like wood and soap, Maisie said. Can he come back? Juliet found herself at a loss, standing in her own kitchen, unable to explain to a 6-year-old that the man who had accidentally made her feel safe enough to whisper a word she had locked away for 2 years was the facilities coordinator who changed the light bulbs on her floor, and that the distance between his world and theirs was the kind of distance corporate buildings were designed to maintain without anyone having to say it out loud. He fixes the building, baby, she said. Can he fix ours? Maisie said, and Juliet did not have an answer for that, and the question followed her to work the next morning, and sat quietly in the corner of every meeting she attended for the rest of the week. The two girls met because children do not observe the boundaries adults build. Zara came to the office one afternoon when school let out early, and Callum had nowhere else to bring her. She sat in the lobby with her sketchbook, and within 20 minutes she had found Maisie, who had been brought in by the nanny while Juliet finished a board presentation. They were on the floor together inside half an hour, drawing, conspiring, whispering in the language children invent between themselves that requires no introduction and no permission. Zara drew buildings. Maisie drew animals. They merged these interests into a collaborative project that involved an elephant living inside a skyscraper, which they both agreed was the greatest artistic achievement either had ever produced. When Callum came to collect Zara at 5, Maisie looked up at him with enormous steady eyes and said, "Your daughter is really good at roofs." Callum glanced at Juliet, who had arrived at the same moment from the opposite corridor, and the two of them stood there like bookends to a scene neither had planned, watching their daughters on the floor of a lobby that was supposed to separate their worlds, and failing entirely to find a reason why it should. The following week, Zara asked if Maisie could come to the shop. Callum had kept a small woodworking space in a rented garage on the east side, nowhere close to a real workshop, but enough for a man who needed to work with his hands the way some people needed to run. He said yes, because saying no would have required explaining something he was not ready to explain, and because Maisie's face when she walked into the shop and saw the sawdust and the tools and the half-finished bookshelf was the face of a child discovering a room that made sense to her in a way the glass tower where her mother worked never had. The girls sat together on the workshop floor drawing while Callum worked, and at some point Maisie said, without looking up from her paper, "You smell like wood and soap." "My dad used to smell like grass and rain." Callum kept sanding. He did not look at her. He did not tell her it would be okay. He just said, "Those are good smells." She nodded. Then she went back to her drawing, and the room held its breath and let the moment pass without breaking it. Juliet picked Maisie up from the shop that evening and stood in the doorway, looking at the space the way you look at a room that has answered a question you did not know you were asking. Small, warm, sawdust on the floor, a man in a work shirt building something with care, her daughter drawing contentedly in a corner she had claimed as her own. This was not her world. Nothing in it was polished or strategic or designed to impress, and it was the first place in 2 years where Maisie had voluntarily talked about her father. She did not say any of this. She just stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, and Callum looked up from his work and held her gaze, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to, because the conversation happening between them had been going on for weeks now and had never once required words. Graham filed the complaint on a Monday. He framed it with the precision of a man who understood how institutions protected themselves. Inappropriate boundary crossing between a facilities employee and the CEO's minor child. Unauthorized contact outside working hours. Potential safeguarding concern. He submitted it to Human Resources with a note expressing deep personal concern for Maisie's well-being, and within 48 hours, Callum was sitting in a windowless room across from 2 HR representatives and a printed incident report that described the night of the party as though it were something that needed investigating. Callum read the report. He set it down. He did not get angry. He did not explain the context, or describe the look on Juliet's face in the doorway, or talk about a little girl who had whispered a word she had been holding inside for 2 years. He said, "I went to check on my daughter. The room was dark. I tucked in the wrong child. I realized my mistake, and I left." That is the whole story. The HR lead asked whether he had any ongoing contact with the CEO's daughter outside the workplace. Callum was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "My daughter and her daughter are friends. They draw together. I am not going to apologize for that, and I am not going to pretend it did not happen." Graham recommended immediate termination with cause. The HR team scheduled a review for Friday. Callum went home that night and sat on Zara's bed after she fell asleep and held the blue blanket in his hands and thought about all the ways a man could do the right thing and still have it turned into something it was not. He thought about Maisie's small voice in the dark. He thought about what it meant that the first person in 2 years to hear her say "Daddy" was someone who did not even know he was listening. And he thought about Juliet, standing in a doorway, her hand flat against her chest, and whether the distance between their floors was really about job titles, or whether it was about something older and uglier that nobody in that building had the courage to name. He did not call her. He did not text. He went to work on Tuesday in his tool belt, and did his job, and fixed a water heater on the 3rd floor, and said nothing to anyone about anything. Juliet found out about the complaint on Wednesday, not from HR, but from a sentence Graham dropped into a meeting that was so carefully casual it could only have been rehearsed. Something about safeguarding protocols and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries between staff and executive families. He said it without looking at her, which was how she knew he had aimed it directly at her. She pulled the full report from HR that afternoon. She read it twice. Then, she sat in her office, with the door closed for 10 minutes, which her assistant said she had never done in 3 years, and when she came out, her face was the face she wore when she had made a decision that the rest of the building was about to feel. The review was scheduled for Friday morning at 9. Juliet walked into the room unannounced at 8:55, before the panel had finished arranging their folders. Graham was seated at the far end of the table in the observer chair he had requested. Legs crossed, pen in hand, wearing the expression of a man who believed the outcome was already written. Juliet did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table and spoke clearly enough that the words reached every corner of the room without her ever raising her voice. 2 years ago, my daughter stopped saying the word "daddy." She saw 3 therapists. I hired 8 different caregivers who tried every approach in every book on childhood grief I could find. Not one of them reached her. And on the night of the company holiday party, a man who works in this building went upstairs to check on his own child, found mine by accident in a dark room, and tucked her in because that is what a father does when he finds a child uncovered. And my daughter, who has not said that word to a single living person in 730 days, whispered it to him. Not because he asked for it, not because he tried, because his hands were gentle, and the room was safe, and she was ready, and he happened to be there. She paused. The room was very still, and the response of this company, she said, her voice dropping lower, was to schedule a disciplinary review. She looked at Graham. She held his gaze long enough that every person in the room understood exactly who had filed the complaint, and exactly why. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "you will be reassigned to the regional office in Raleigh effective Monday. Your concerns have been noted and addressed. This review is closed." Graham opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. He closed it, gathered his pen, and left the room with the specific quietness of a man who had just learned that the power he had been borrowing was never his to spend. Callum, who had been waiting in the corridor, heard none of it. He only knew something had changed when the HR lead came out and told him, simply, that the matter had been resolved and he should return to work. He stood there for a moment in his tool belt, nodded once, and went to fix a thermostat on the 4th floor. Because that was what was on his work order, and because doing the next thing in front of him had always been the only reliable compass he knew. Months passed. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but with the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that, when you lined them up, looked more and more like a life being built. Friday evenings became a thing. Not planned, not discussed, just gradually established the way traditions establish themselves when nobody is watching. Callum would bring Zara to the workshop after school. Juliet would bring Maisie after work, still in her blazer, still carrying the posture of a woman who ran 400 people, and she would sit on the old stool by the window and watch her daughter draw while Callum worked. Some nights they talked. Some nights they did not. The girls always talked, in the fast private language of children who had decided they belonged to each other and were not interested in adult approval on the matter. Maisie started calling Callum by his name, not Daddy. That word had belonged to one person, and she had given it away once in the dark to a stranger whose hands felt safe, and she was not ready to give it away again. But she said Callum the way some children say a name that matters to them, with a warmth that went beyond the syllables, as though the word itself had become a small place she could stand in when the world felt too large. Zara, for her part, had begun showing Maisie her mother's blanket. Not lending it, showing it. Explaining it, in the serious way children explain sacred objects, touching the frayed edge, and saying this is from before, the way archaeologists describe artifacts. Maisie listened with the enormous patience of a 6-year-old who understood loss well enough to know that some things could not be rushed and some objects could not be shared. And some stories needed to be received in silence before they could be answered. One Friday in early spring, Callum built a small stool for Maisie. Not because anyone asked, not because it was part of a plan. He built it because she had been sitting on an overturned bucket in his workshop for weeks, and it bothered him the way unfinished work always bothered him. He shaped it from white oak, the same wood as Zara's bookshelf, and he angled the seat the way his daughter had once drawn it in a sketch that changed his life, for how people actually sit. Maisie sat on it that evening and did not say anything for a long time. Then she looked up at Juliet, who was watching from the doorway with an expression she could no longer hide and had stopped trying to, and said, "He built me a chair. Mom, a real one." Juliet looked at the stool. She looked at the man who had made it. She looked at her daughter sitting in something built specifically for her small, specific body by hands that carried the same careful attention, whether they were fixing a water heater on the 3rd floor or smoothing the grain on a piece of oak meant for a child. And she understood, standing in that doorway for the second time in their story, that whatever was growing between the 4 of them had already grown past the point where pretending otherwise was honest. She did not say, "I love you." Neither did he. Those were words for a later evening, and they both seemed to understand that arriving too early would cheapen the architecture of what they had been building, one Friday at a time, without blueprints or deadlines, in the only way either of them had ever trusted. Slowly, and with care, and with their daughters drawing side by side on a workshop floor as the evening light came gold through the west window. The last scene of this story happens in a dark room. It is months later. A Friday. Zara is sleeping at Juliet's apartment because the girls refused to be separated and negotiation had failed. Maisie is in her bed. Zara is on the trundle beside her, wrapped in Claire's pale blue blanket. The room is quiet and warm, and smells faintly of the lavender soap Juliet keeps in the hallway closet. Callum goes in to check. Not by accident this time. On purpose, the way a man does when he has been invited into a life and has chosen to stay. He crouches beside Maisie's bed. He pulls the blanket higher around her shoulders. He smooths her hair back with 2 gentle fingers, the same gesture, the same care, given now with full knowledge of who this child is and what this moment means. Maisie stirs. Her eyes open halfway. She looks at him in the blue light from the window. "Good night, Callum," she whispers. He smiles. "Good night, Maisie." Zara, on the trundle beside her, shifts and mumbles without opening her eyes. "Good night, Maisie's mom." From the doorway, Juliet's quiet laugh breaks the silence like a sound that has been waiting years for permission to exist. Callum stands. He turns. Juliet is leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, her face half lit by the hallway light, wearing an expression he has never seen on her before because she has never allowed herself to wear it. Not the composed face of a chief executive, not the careful face of a single mother managing. Just a woman, standing in the doorway of a room full of sleeping children and a man who had wandered into her life by accident and stayed on purpose, looking at him the way people look at something they have finally decided to keep. He walks toward her. He stops close enough that the distance between them is no longer a distance at all. "I tucked in the right one this time," he says. "You did," she says. And this time her voice does not shake. Every love story people remember begins with a small ordinary moment that nobody planned. A braid that would not sit straight. A blanket carried to a party. A dark room and a sleeping child, and 2 words whispered by accident to a stranger whose hands happened to feel like home. What followed was not dramatic. It was not a rescue. It was 2 people, both tired, both carrying more than they showed, finding in the quiet space between a freight elevator and a corner office a version of the world that made more sense with the other person in it. And in a workshop on the east side of Charlotte, there are now 2 small stools side by side. One made of white oak for a girl who draws buildings. One made of cherry for a girl who draws animals. They are the same height. They sit at the same angle. And every Friday evening, they are occupied. So let me ask you something tonight. Has a moment you did not plan, a word you did not mean to say, ever opened a door you did not know was there? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. New stories every week.